The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the convoy of military vehicles as they rolled through the dusty terrain of Afghanistan's Helmand province. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her tactical vest and wiped the sweat from her forehead, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. At 28 years old, she had already completed 2 tours of duty. But something about this mission felt different. The intelligence reports had been conflicting, and the usual chatter on enemy communications had gone mysteriously silent. Sitting across from her in the armored vehicle was Commander James Mitchell, a decorated officer with 15 years of service under his belt. Mitchell had earned the respect of every soldier in their unit through his calm leadership and unwavering dedication to bringing everyone home safely. He was reviewing mission briefings on his tablet when he noticed Maria's concerned expression. "Something bothering you, Santos?" Mitchell asked, his voice barely audible over the rumble of the engine. Maria hesitated for a moment before responding. "Sir, the locals we spoke to yesterday seemed unusually nervous. Even the children who usually wave at our convoys were nowhere to be seen. It feels like the entire region is holding its breath." Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. He had learned to trust his soldiers' instincts, especially those of veterans like Maria who had an uncanny ability to read the subtle signs that often preceded trouble. The convoy was heading to a remote outpost where they would coordinate with local Afghan forces on a joint operation to secure a strategic mountain pass. As they approached a narrow valley between 2 rocky hills, the convoy slowed down. The lead vehicle's commander radioed back that they needed to navigate carefully through what appeared to be recent rockfall debris scattered across the road. Maria felt her stomach tighten as she observed the terrain around them. The hills on either side provided perfect cover for anyone wanting to set up an ambush. "Sir," she said quietly to Mitchell, "this looks like a textbook ambush point. The debris could be deliberately placed to slow us down and make us sitting targets." Before Mitchell could respond, the sharp crack of rifle fire echoed through the valley. The convoy immediately came under heavy attack from multiple positions on both hillsides. Bullets pinged off the armored vehicles as the soldiers inside scrambled to return fire through the gun ports. The radio crackled with urgent communications as each vehicle reported their status and tried to coordinate a response. Mitchell was immediately on the radio, calling for air support and trying to establish contact with the forward operating base. But as he leaned forward to get a better view of the tactical situation, a rocket-propelled grenade struck the hillside just meters from their vehicle. The explosion sent a shower of rocks and debris crashing down, and one large boulder struck the side of their vehicle with tremendous force. The impact caused the heavy armored vehicle to lurch violently to one side. Mitchell, who had been standing to get a better view through the commander's hatch, was thrown off balance. His safety harness caught him, but the force of the impact had damaged the hatch mechanism, and it began to close rapidly on his head and shoulders. Maria saw what was happening in an instant. The heavy hatch was closing like a vice, and if it completed its descent, it would either crush Mitchell or trap him in a position where he couldn't move or command effectively. Without hesitation, she launched herself forward, grabbing Mitchell around the waist and pulling him down into the vehicle's interior. Just as the damaged hatch slammed shut with a resounding clang, both soldiers crashed to the floor of the vehicle in a tangle of equipment and gear. Mitchell's helmet had been knocked askew, and there was a deep cut on his forehead where the edge of the hatch had caught him. But he was alive and conscious, and that was what mattered most to Maria in that moment. "Thank you, Santos," Mitchell gasped, struggling to catch his breath. That was too close, but their immediate danger was far from over. The attack was intensifying, and they could hear the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. The enemy had clearly planned this ambush carefully, using the terrain to their advantage and timing their attack for maximum effect. The convoy was pinned down in the kill zone with limited options for movement or escape. Maria helped Mitchell to his feet and handed him his rifle. Despite the cut on his head, the commander's training kicked in immediately. He was back on the radio, coordinating the defensive effort and calling for immediate extraction support. But the radio traffic was chaotic, with multiple units under fire and competing for priority on limited resources. Through the armored glass windows, Maria could see muzzle flashes from at least a dozen different positions on the surrounding hills. The enemy had them completely surrounded and was using coordinated fire teams to keep the convoy pinned down. Several of the vehicles had already taken significant damage, and she could hear the wounded calling for medical assistance over the radio. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Maria knew that they needed to do something decisive soon, or risk being overrun entirely. The enemy was using classic guerrilla tactics, striking hard and fast before melting back into the rocky terrain where close air support would have difficulty engaging them effectively. As bullets continued to strike their vehicle and the sound of explosions grew closer, Maria made a decision that would change everything. She had noticed something during the initial moments of the attack that might give them a tactical advantage, but it would require taking an enormous risk. The question was whether she could convince Mitchell to trust her judgment and authorize what others might consider a reckless plan. The fate of the entire convoy now hung in the balance, and the next few minutes would determine whether they would all make it home alive or become another casualty statistic in an increasingly dangerous war. Maria wiped the dust from her combat goggles and studied the tactical situation through the vehicle's periscope. During those first chaotic moments of the ambush, she had spotted something that the others had missed. On the eastern hillside, partially concealed behind a large boulder formation, she had seen the distinctive antenna array of what appeared to be a command and control position. The enemy fighters were using sophisticated communication equipment to coordinate their attack, which explained why their fire was so well organized and effective. "Commander," she said urgently, "I think I've identified their command post. It's approximately 400 meters northeast behind the large rock formation that looks like a camel's hump." Mitchell followed her gaze and squinted through his own optical equipment. The position she was indicating was heavily fortified and well concealed, but now that she had pointed it out, he could see the telltale signs of enemy activity. Radio antennas, carefully camouflaged fighting positions, and what appeared to be a mortar team, setting up for indirect fire support. "Good eye, Santos," Mitchell acknowledged. "But that position is practically impregnable from our current location. We'd need to get much closer to have any hope of taking it out, and movement in this terrain under fire would be suicide." Maria had been thinking about exactly that problem. During her previous deployment, she had trained extensively with the Special Operations Forces attached to their unit. She had learned advanced reconnaissance and infiltration techniques that most regular infantry soldiers never mastered. More importantly, she had studied the terrain in this region extensively and knew about the network of dried-up irrigation channels that crisscrossed the valley floor. "Sir, there's an old irrigation ditch that runs along the base of that hill," she explained, tracing the route on her tactical map. "It's probably been dry for years, but it should provide concealed movement for at least half the distance. If I can get close enough, I might be able to call in precise coordinates for air support, or even take out their communications equipment with grenades." Mitchell shook his head immediately. "Absolutely not, Santos. That's a suicide mission. Even if you made it to the ditch without being spotted, you'd be completely on your own with no backup and no way to retreat if things went wrong." But Maria had already made up her mind. She could see that the convoy's situation was becoming more desperate by the minute. 2 of the vehicles had taken serious damage, and several soldiers had been wounded. The enemy mortar team was starting to find their range, and it was only a matter of time before they scored a direct hit on one of the vehicles. Someone had to take action, and she was the only one in position to do it. "Commander, with respect, we're running out of options," she argued. "That command post is directing the entire attack. If we can take it out, the rest of their fighters will lose coordination, and we might have a chance to break out of this kill zone." Before Mitchell could respond, a mortar round impacted just 20 meters from their vehicle, showering them with rocks and debris. The explosion was close enough that they could feel the concussion through the armored hull, and the radio immediately crackled with damage reports from the other vehicles in the convoy. Maria didn't wait for permission. She grabbed her rifle, extra ammunition, and a bag of grenades, then moved toward the vehicle's rear exit. "I'm going, sir. Cover me as much as you can, and be ready to move the convoy when I give the signal." "Santos, wait," Mitchell called after her, but she was already at the door. She paused just long enough to look back at him. "Sir, you've always told us that leadership means making the hard decisions when no one else can. Well, this is mine." With that, she activated the door mechanism and slipped out into the hellish landscape of the ambush zone. The noise was immediately overwhelming. The crack of rifle fire, the whistle of bullets passing overhead, and the occasional boom of exploding ordnance. She pressed herself against the armored hull of the vehicle and took a moment to orient herself before beginning her dangerous journey. The irrigation ditch she had spotted was about 30 meters away across open ground. It might as well have been 30 kilometers given the intensity of enemy fire crisscrossing the area. But Maria had learned patience during her reconnaissance training. She waited for the right moment when the enemy fire seemed to shift focus to another part of the convoy, and sprinted as fast as she could toward the ditch. Bullets kicked up dust around her feet as she ran, but somehow she made it to the concealment of the dried-up channel without being hit. The ditch was deeper than she had expected, which was good news for concealment but made movement more difficult. She had to crouch low and move carefully to avoid making noise that might give away her position. As she began working her way toward the enemy command post, Maria could hear the radio chatter from the convoy growing more urgent. Mitchell was doing his best to coordinate the defense, but she could tell from his voice that he was running out of options. Air support was still minutes away, and the convoy couldn't hold their position much longer without taking catastrophic casualties. The irrigation ditch wound its way across the valley, floor in a serpentine pattern that provided excellent concealment, but also made navigation challenging. Maria had to constantly check her compass and landmarks to make sure she was heading in the right direction. The enemy command post was somewhere ahead of her, but she couldn't see it from her current position in the ditch. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, she reached a point where the ditch curved around a large boulder that she recognized from her earlier observation. The enemy command post should be just on the other side of the ridge above her. She could hear voices speaking in Pashto, and the distinctive sound of radio equipment crackling with communications. Maria carefully climbed out of the ditch and began working her way up the rocky slope toward the enemy position. Every step had to be calculated and silent. One loose rock or careless movement could alert the enemy fighters to her presence and doom not only her mission, but the entire convoy below. As she got closer, she could see the command post clearly for the first time. It was more sophisticated than she had expected, with multiple radio operators, a mortar fire direction team, and what appeared to be a senior commander coordinating the entire attack. This was definitely the nerve center of the enemy operation, and taking it out would cripple their ability to continue the coordinated assault on the convoy. Maria crouched behind a cluster of jagged rocks, her heart pounding as she studied the enemy command post just 20 meters ahead. She could see 4 fighters clearly, 2 radio operators hunched over their equipment, one man who appeared to be a senior commander based on his bearing and the deference shown by the others, and a 4th fighter serving as a lookout with binoculars. The mortar team she had spotted earlier was positioned about 50 meters further up the slope, close enough to be part of the same operation, but far enough away that she would need to deal with them separately. The radio chatter from the command post was constant and urgent. Even though Maria didn't speak Pashto fluently, she had picked up enough tactical terminology during her deployments to understand that they were coordinating fire from multiple positions and preparing for what sounded like a final assault on the trapped convoy. Time was running out, and she knew that Mitchell and the others were counting on her to succeed. She carefully pulled a fragmentation grenade from her vest and studied the layout of the enemy position. The radio equipment was clustered in a natural depression between several large boulders, which would help contain the blast and maximize damage to their communications gear, but she would need to get much closer to ensure accuracy, and that meant crossing open ground where she could easily be spotted. Maria waited for the right moment, listening to the rhythm of the battle below. When she heard the distinctive sound of the convoy's heavy machine guns opening up in a sustained burst, she knew that the enemy fighters would likely be focused on returning fire, rather than watching for infiltrators. She moved quickly but quietly, using every piece of available cover as she worked her way closer to the command post. When she was within 15 meters, she pulled the pin on her grenade and counted off the seconds in her head. The timing had to be perfect. Too short, and the enemy might have time to scatter. Too long, and they might spot the grenade and take cover. She cooked off the grenade for 2 seconds, then hurled it directly into the center of the radio equipment cluster. The explosion was devastating in the confined space between the rocks. All of the radio equipment was destroyed instantly, and 3 of the 4 enemy fighters were killed or seriously wounded. The 4th man, the lookout with the binoculars, had been far enough away to survive the blast, but he was clearly stunned and disoriented. Maria didn't hesitate. She emerged from cover with her rifle ready and quickly secured the position. ensuring that none of the enemy fighters posed any further threat. The radio equipment was completely destroyed, which meant that the coordinated attack on the convoy should begin to fall apart as the scattered fighting positions lost their ability to communicate with each other. But her mission was only half complete. The mortar team up the slope was still operational and posed a serious threat to the convoy. She could hear them calling out in confusion, trying to understand what had happened to their command post. It wouldn't take them long to figure out that they were under attack from behind their own lines. Maria grabbed the lookout's binoculars and used them to study the mortar position. She could see 3 fighters with what appeared to be a Soviet-era 82mm mortar and a stack of ammunition. They were in the process of adjusting their aim for another barrage on the convoy, and she knew she had to stop them before they could fire again. The approach to the mortar position would be much more difficult than the command post. The terrain was more open, and the enemy fighters were alert and looking for threats after hearing the explosion below. But Maria had one significant advantage. They weren't expecting an attack from their rear, and their position was oriented toward the valley where they could observe and engage the convoy. She began working her way up the slope, using the natural folds in the terrain to mask her movement. The rocky ground was treacherous, and she had to be extremely careful not to dislodge any stones that might give away her position. Every few meters she paused to listen and observe, making sure that she hadn't been detected. As she got closer, she could hear the mortar team's urgent conversations. One of them was clearly trying to establish radio contact with the command post, while another was making final adjustments to the mortar's elevation and azimuth. The third fighter appeared to be preparing to drop another round down the tube, which meant that Maria had only seconds to act before they fired another potentially devastating barrage at her fellow soldiers below. She made the decision to abandon stealth in favor of speed. Rising to a combat stance, she charged the final 20 meters to the mortar position, firing her rifle as she ran. Her first shots took down the fighter who was about to drop the mortar round, causing him to fall across the weapon and disrupting their firing sequence. The other 2 enemy fighters scrambled for their weapons, but Maria had the advantage of surprise and superior positioning. Her training kicked in as she engaged them with precise, controlled bursts of automatic fire. Both fighters went down before they could return effective fire, and suddenly the hilltop was silent except for the distant sounds of the battle in the valley below. Maria quickly examined the mortar and its ammunition supply. The weapon appeared to be in working condition, and there were at least a dozen high-explosive rounds stacked nearby. An idea began to form in her mind. Instead of simply destroying the mortar, she might be able to turn it against the remaining enemy positions. She had received basic training on foreign weapon systems, including Soviet-era mortars, during her advanced military courses. The 82mm mortar was a relatively simple weapon to operate, and she thought she could figure out how to use it effectively. But first, she needed to establish communication with the convoy and coordinate her next move with Mitchell. Using the radio from one of the fallen enemy fighters, she managed to contact Mitchell on their emergency frequency. His relief at hearing her voice was evident even through the static and interference. "Santos, what's your status?" Mitchell's voice crackled through the radio. "Command post is destroyed, mortar team is neutralized," she reported. "But I think I can do more than just take out their equipment. This mortar is still operational, and I have a clear view of several enemy positions from up here." There was a pause before Mitchell responded. "Santos, you're not trained as a mortar operator. That's extremely dangerous without proper support." "Sir, I've got basic training on the system, and the situation down there isn't getting any better. I can see at least 3 enemy positions that are giving you the most trouble. If I can drop some rounds on them, it might give you the opening you need to break out of the kill zone." Down in the valley, Mitchell was weighing his options. The convoy was still taking heavy fire, and despite Maria's success in disrupting the enemy's coordination, they remained pinned down with limited options for escape. Air support was still several minutes away, and he wasn't sure they could hold their position that long without taking severe casualties. Mitchell made his decision quickly. "Santos, you're authorized to engage targets of opportunity with that mortar, but be extremely careful with your range calculations. We're dangerously close to some of those positions." Maria acknowledged the order and immediately set to work examining the mortar more closely. The weapon was old but appeared to be well maintained, and the sight system was still functional. She found a range card that the enemy mortar team had been using, which showed pre-calculated firing data for various targets in the valley. Most importantly, it included coordinates for the convoy's current position, which would help her avoid hitting friendly forces. Using the binoculars, she began identifying the enemy positions that were causing the most problems for the convoy. The largest concentration of enemy fire was coming from a rocky outcropping about 600 meters to the northwest, where she could see muzzle flashes from at least 4 different weapons. A second position was dug into the reverse slope of a small hill about 400 meters to the southwest, and a third group was firing from behind a stone wall that had probably once been part of a sheep pen. Maria selected the northwestern position as her first target since it appeared to house the heaviest concentration of enemy fighters. She carefully calculated the range and elevation, using both the enemy range card and her own estimates based on terrain features. Mortar fire required precise calculations. Too short and she might hit the convoy. Too long, and she would waste precious ammunition while giving the enemy time to relocate. She loaded the first round and made her final adjustments to the mortar's position. Taking a deep breath, she dropped the high-explosive round down the tube and immediately covered her ears. The mortar fired with a distinctive thump, and she watched through the binoculars as the round arced through the air toward its target. The explosion erupted right in the middle of the enemy position, sending rocks and debris flying in all directions. She could see enemy fighters scrambling away from the impact area, and the volume of fire coming from that position immediately decreased significantly. But she didn't have time to celebrate. There were still other targets to engage, and the enemy would soon figure out where the mortar fire was coming from. Maria quickly adjusted her aim toward the second target and loaded another round. This shot required a different elevation and azimuth, and she had to work quickly to make the necessary calculations. The second round impacted slightly long of the target, but close enough to force the enemy fighters to abandon their position and seek cover elsewhere. The third target proved to be the most challenging. The stone wall was partially concealed by terrain features, and she wasn't entirely certain of the range. She decided to fire 2 rounds in quick succession, adjusting between shots to bracket the target. The first round fell short, but the second one scored a direct hit on the wall, collapsing a section of it and eliminating the threat from that position. The effect on the battle was immediate and dramatic. With 3 major enemy positions neutralized or suppressed, the volume of incoming fire on the convoy decreased by at least half. Mitchell's voice came over the radio with barely contained excitement. "Outstanding work, Santos. You've given us the opening we need. We're going to attempt a breakout in 2 minutes. Can you provide covering fire as we move?" "Affirmative, sir," Maria replied. "I still have several rounds left and I can see the entire valley from up here. Just give me your route and timing." Mitchell quickly outlined their escape plan. The convoy would move in 2 groups. The damaged vehicles would go first, supported by the more mobile units, and they would head for a wider part of the valley, where they could spread out and present less concentrated targets. Maria would provide mortar support to suppress any enemy positions that tried to engage the moving convoy. As the first group of vehicles began to move, Maria watched through her binoculars for any signs of enemy activity. She could see scattered fighters trying to reposition themselves to engage the convoy, but they were clearly disorganized and no longer operating under centralized command. When she spotted a group of 3 fighters trying to set up a rocket-propelled grenade launcher in a position that would threaten the convoy's route, she immediately engaged them with another mortar round. The breakout was proceeding better than anyone had dared to hope. The convoy was moving steadily through the valley, and while they were still taking some scattered fire, it was no longer the coordinated and devastating barrage they had faced earlier. Maria continued to provide covering fire, carefully husbanding her remaining ammunition and selecting only the most threatening targets. But just as it seemed like the convoy might escape without further casualties, Maria spotted a new threat. A group of enemy fighters was moving rapidly along a ridgeline that would put them in position to ambush the convoy at a narrow choke point ahead. There were at least 6 fighters in the group, and they were carrying heavy weapons that could cause serious damage to the vehicles. The problem was that this new threat was at the extreme range of the mortar, and the terrain made accurate fire extremely difficult. Maria would have to make several adjustments to her firing position and hope that she could engage the enemy before they reached their ambush position. But time was running out. The convoy would reach the choke point in less than 3 minutes, She quickly repositioned the mortar and began calculating a firing solution for the new target. The range was nearly 800 meters, at the upper limit of what the weapon could effectively engage. The elevation required would put the mortar at almost maximum angle, and any error in her calculations could send the rounds far off target. Maria loaded her next-to-last high-explosive round and made her best estimate of the firing data. She knew that this shot was crucial. If the enemy fighters reached their intended ambush position, they could inflict severe casualties on the convoy even at this late stage of the breakout. The round arced high through the air, and she held her breath as she watched for the impact. The explosion occurred slightly ahead of the moving enemy fighters, but close enough to force them to take cover and disrupt their movement. She immediately loaded her last round and adjusted her aim based on where she had seen the first impact. This time, the round landed directly among the enemy group, and she could see through her binoculars that the threat had been eliminated. "Convoy clear of the kill zone," Mitchell's voice announced over the radio. "All vehicles accounted for and moving to secure area. Santos, you need to get out of there immediately. Enemy reinforcements are probably on the way to your position." Maria looked around at the hilltop littered with destroyed equipment and enemy casualties. She had accomplished far more than anyone could have expected. But now she faced the dangerous task of getting back to friendly forces. The enemy would certainly be looking for whoever had caused such devastation to their ambush, and she was isolated and outnumbered in hostile territory. Maria quickly destroyed the remaining mortar ammunition to prevent it from being used against future coalition forces, then gathered her equipment and began planning her escape route. The convoy had moved approximately 2 kilometers northeast and was setting up a defensive perimeter in a more open area where they could better defend against attack, but getting there would require crossing hostile territory where enemy reinforcements might already be moving to intercept her. She decided that her best option was to follow a different route than the one the convoy had taken, using the terrain. To her advantage, she began moving southeast along a series of ridgelines that would keep her above the valley floor, while providing multiple escape routes if she encountered enemy forces. The rocky terrain was difficult to navigate, but it also provided excellent concealment from anyone searching for her from below. As she moved carefully from boulder to boulder, Maria could hear the distant sound of vehicles and voices in the valley. The enemy was definitely responding to the attack, but they seemed to be focusing their search efforts in the wrong area. They were probably assuming that whoever had attacked their positions had retreated along the same route as the convoy, which gave her a significant advantage. After an hour of careful movement through the mountains, Maria reached a vantage point where she could see the convoy's new position in the distance. Mitchell had chosen the location well. It was on slightly elevated ground with good fields, a fire in all directions, and the vehicles were positioned to provide mutual support. She could also see that air support had finally arrived in the form of 2 attack helicopters that were conducting reconnaissance sweeps of the surrounding area. But there was a problem. Between her current position and the convoy was nearly a kilometer of open ground with minimal cover. During daylight hours, crossing that terrain would be extremely dangerous, as she would be visible to any enemy forces in the area. She would need to wait for darkness, or find another way to signal the convoy that she was alive and needed extraction. Maria checked her radio and found that she could still reach Mitchell on their emergency frequency, though the signal was weak due to the terrain between them. She decided to take the risk of breaking radio silence to let him know her situation. "Wildcard 6, this is Santos. I'm approximately 1 kilometer southeast of your position but separated by open terrain. Request instructions for link-up." Mitchell's response was immediate and filled with relief. "Santos, we thought we'd lost you up there. Can you find concealment and wait for nightfall? We'll send a patrol to extract you after dark." "Negative, sir. I can see enemy movement in the valley and they're definitely searching for whoever hit their positions. I don't think we have until nightfall." There was a pause as Mitchell considered the options. "Can you make it to the ridgeline directly south of our position? It's about 600 meters of open ground, but we can provide overwatch and covering fire if needed." Maria studied the terrain carefully through her binoculars. The route Mitchell was suggesting would require her to cross a dried-up stream bed and then climb a fairly steep slope to reach the ridgeline. It would take at least 15 minutes of movement through terrain, where she would be completely exposed for significant portions of the journey. I can do it, sir, but I'll need coordinated covering fire and possibly air support if enemy forces try to intercept me. Understood. Give us 10 minutes to coordinate with the helicopters and position our weapons for maximum coverage. When you're ready to move, call execute and we'll light up anything that moves in that valley. Maria used the waiting time to plan her route in detail and prepare her equipment for rapid movement. She redistributed her ammunition and gear to ensure that she wasn't carrying anything unnecessary that might slow her down. Every second would count once she started moving across the open ground. When she was ready, she keyed her radio. Wildcard 6, this is Santos. Execute, execute, execute. Immediately, the convoy's heavy weapons opened fire on suspected enemy positions throughout the valley. The two attack helicopters began making low passes, adding their firepower to the suppression effort. The noise was tremendous, and Maria knew that any enemy forces in the area would be forced to keep their heads down or risk being engaged by superior firepower. She sprinted down the slope toward the stream bed, using the covering fire as an umbrella of protection. Bullets kicked up dust around her feet, indicating that despite the suppression fire, some enemy fighters were still trying to engage her. But the volume of covering fire from the convoy made accurate shooting nearly impossible for anyone trying to target her. The stream bed provided a few seconds of concealment as she crossed it, but then she was back in the open for the final climb to the ridgeline. This was the most dangerous part of the journey, as she would be moving uphill and therefore slower and more visible. Her lungs burned as she pushed herself to maintain maximum speed despite the steep terrain and thin mountain air. Halfway up the slope, she heard the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. The enemy had managed to get another mortar team into action, and they were trying to bracket her position with indirect fire. The first rounds fell short, but she could hear the adjustments being called out in Pashto, and she knew that the next salvo would be much closer. One of the attack helicopters must have spotted the enemy mortar position, because suddenly the air was filled with the sound of rocket fire as the aircraft engaged the target. The explosion was massive, and the incoming mortar fire stopped abruptly. Maria didn't pause to look back but continued climbing as fast as her legs would carry her. She reached the ridgeline just as enemy small arms fire began to concentrate on her position. Bullets were striking the rocks around her as she dove for cover behind a large boulder. The convoy's covering fire was still effective, but she was now close enough to friendly lines that they had to be careful not to hit her with their own rounds. "Santos, you're almost home," Mitchell's voice encouraged her over the radio. "One more bound and you'll be in our perimeter. We've got teams moving out to provide close cover for your final approach." Maria could see friendly soldiers moving toward her position, but they were still 100 meters away and separated from her by a small saddle in the ridgeline, where she would again be exposed to enemy fire. She gathered her courage for one final sprint, knowing that this last stretch would determine whether she made it back alive or became another casualty of the Afghanistan war. The enemy seemed to realize this was their last chance to stop her, and the volume of fire increased dramatically as she emerged from cover. But the convoy's gunners had anticipated this, and their suppressive fire was perfectly timed to coincide with her movement. The combination of heavy machine gun fire and helicopter support created a wall of steel that kept most of the enemy fire inaccurate. Maria reached the advancing friendly patrol just as her strength was beginning to fail. Strong hands grabbed her and pulled her into the safety of their defensive formation. And suddenly, she was surrounded by fellow soldiers who were providing protection as they moved back toward the convoy's main position. As Maria was helped into the convoy's defensive perimeter, she collapsed to her knees, finally allowing exhaustion to overtake her. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the entire ordeal was wearing off, and the full magnitude of what she had accomplished was beginning to sink in. Mitchell was there immediately, kneeling beside her with the unit's medic to check for injuries. "Santos, you just saved this entire convoy," Mitchell said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've never seen anything like what you did up there. You single-handedly turned the tide of that entire engagement." The medic confirmed that apart from exhaustion, dehydration, and some minor cuts and bruises, Maria was uninjured. As word of her actions spread through the convoy, soldiers began gathering around to see the woman who had taken on an entire enemy command structure by herself and won. The looks of respect and admiration on their faces made her uncomfortable. She had simply done what needed to be done to protect her fellow soldiers, Over the next several hours, as the convoy waited for additional support to arrive and the area to be cleared of remaining enemy forces, the full scope of Maria's achievement became clear. Intelligence officers who arrived with the reinforcements confirmed that she had eliminated a sophisticated enemy command and control network that had been responsible for multiple successful ambushes over the previous months. The communications equipment she had destroyed included advanced radios and coordination systems that the enemy had been using to conduct increasingly effective attacks against coalition forces. The enemy casualties from her actions were significant, at least 12, confirmed killed and several more wounded. But more importantly, she had disrupted an entire network of fighters who had been operating with near impunity in that region. The psychological impact on the remaining enemy forces was equally significant, as word spread that a single American soldier had infiltrated and destroyed what they had considered an impregnable position. Within days, Maria's actions had become legendary throughout the military units operating in Afghanistan. The story spread through informal channels at first, soldiers talking to other soldiers, sharing the incredible tale of the staff sergeant who had saved an entire convoy through individual courage and tactical brilliance. But it wasn't long before the formal military hierarchy took notice. Mitchell wrote a detailed after-action report that recommended Maria for the Silver Star, the nation's third highest decoration for valor in combat. His recommendation was endorsed by every level of command, from the battalion commander all the way up to the theater commander. The citation would eventually read that Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had displayed conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an armed enemy, and that her actions had been instrumental in saving the lives of 37 fellow service members. But the recognition extended far beyond military decorations. Maria's story was picked up by military journalists and eventually by mainstream media outlets back home. The image of a young woman single-handedly taking on an enemy stronghold captured the public imagination in a way that few military stories ever do. She became a symbol of American courage and determination in a war that had grown increasingly unpopular with the public. The attention made Maria deeply uncomfortable. She had never sought recognition or fame. She had simply done her job as she saw it. When reporters tried to interview her, she consistently deflected praise back to her fellow soldiers and emphasized that her actions had been part of a team effort. She was particularly adamant that Mitchell receive recognition for his leadership during the crisis and for the split-second decision to authorize her dangerous mission. The military, recognizing both the value of her story and her reluctance to be in the spotlight, handled her case carefully. She was brought back to the United States for the medal ceremony and a limited number of carefully controlled media appearances. The Silver Star presentation took place at the Pentagon, with her family, Mitchell, and several of the soldiers from the convoy in attendance. During the ceremony, the Secretary of the Army spoke about how Maria's actions exemplified the best traditions of the American military. He noted that her quick thinking, tactical expertise, and selfless courage had not only saved lives but had dealt a significant blow to enemy operations in a critical region of Afghanistan. The medal itself was pinned on her uniform by the Secretary, but it was the presence of her fellow soldiers that meant the most to her. After the ceremony, Maria was offered several options for her continued military career. She could have leveraged her newfound fame into prestigious assignments, instructor positions at military schools, or even recruitment roles that would have kept her safely away from combat zones. But after careful consideration, she chose to return to her unit and continue serving as a regular infantry soldier. Her decision surprised many people, but it was entirely consistent with her character. Maria had never sought glory or special treatment. She wanted to continue doing the job she had trained for alongside the soldiers she had served with. Mitchell, who had been promoted to lieutenant colonel partly based on his leadership during the ambush, supported her decision and ensured that she was able to return to meaningful assignments. The legend of Maria Santos continued to grow even after she returned to regular duty. Young soldiers joining the military heard her story during training and were inspired by the example she had set. Military academies began using her actions as a case study in individual initiative and tactical thinking under pressure. She had become a role model for an entire generation of service members. Years later, after completing her military service and transitioning to civilian life, Maria remained reluctant to discuss her most famous day in detail. She had moved to a small town where she worked as a paramedic, continuing her pattern of service to others in a different capacity. When asked about her military experience, she would typically deflect the conversation to her colleagues or to the broader mission they had all served. But occasionally, when speaking to young people considering military service or when addressing veterans groups, she would share the lessons she had learned that day in Afghanistan. She would emphasize that heroism wasn't about seeking glory or taking unnecessary risks, but about doing what needed to be done when others were counting on you. She would talk about the importance of training, preparation, and teamwork, and how individual actions were always part of a larger effort involving many people. The convoy that Maria had helped save that day went on to complete their mission successfully, and several of the soldiers from that unit maintained contact with her for years afterward. Mitchell, who eventually became a general, would often speak about how Maria's actions had taught him important lessons about leadership and the potential of every individual soldier. The story of that day became part of their shared history, a reminder of how quickly circumstances could change and how individual courage could alter the course of events.